Hello and welcome to the 6th webinar of the T20 Summit Season 2020. This webinar is co-hosted by the T20 Saudi Arabia and CPEC, the Center for Implementation of Public Policies Promoting Equity and Growth. My name is Bruno and I am the coordinator of Task Force 5, the task force on the future of multilateralism and global governance. I'm going to lead through the webinar today and also have an eye on the time. If you would like to ask any question, please feel free to do so at any time and write them into the Q&A box below. We'll do our best to answer them either in writing or even integrate the question into the panel. And with no further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Abdulaziz, the task force lead co-chair and chairman of the Gulf Research Center, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends wherever you are in this world. I'd like to welcome all the attendees that today with us when they're attending the task force number 5, the multilateralism and the global governance. First, let me start by thanking the G20 Secretariat and also the T20 engagement group leaders, which is the Kabsark Institute and the King Faisal Center. They have done a great job in putting a lot of the things together and have worked very hard, to ensure the success of such an important task force. Also, I would like to thank my co-chair, whom they have put a great effort, the coordinator also for this, and also I'd like to thank the whole team, the whole paper presenter and the policy paper presenter. They have done a great, a great job and a great work. Since the inception in January 2020, the whole team in the task force have taken a very important and a very significant role, and we have had several meetings, including the important one that in May, which that was post-COVID-19, where a lot of things was discussed, and I'm sure we all have gone through difficult times, spending hours and hours in front of the screen with the Zoom, but luckily we have the Zoom to supplement the distance and the inability to get together physically in one place. At the same time, we have encouraged a lot of people to submit and to participate on the policy brief. We have received 50 good policy brief, but we wanted to make the best, so we have chosen the best 11 out of those 50. They were all excellent. They have gone through a lengthy process of peer review, which then made it a very good and high quality. I do hope that the leadership of the G20 will definitely look at to our policy brief and also to the recommendation we are having. The recommendation and the policy brief, of course, presenter, they will speak themselves today with us, but there are 3 pillars that most of the policy were, focusing on. The first one is the reform of the G20 and all the institutional, and how to institutionalize it to give it more legitimacy and credibility, and then make it much more effective. The second, of course, is the what we call the current challenges, climate change, other issues also related to that. Beside the climate change, that people, have felt that it's important, to focus on it. And the third, of course, unconventional, which is the future challenges, such as cybersecurity, moving toward diplomacy, that one, artificial intelligence, and how to work with all these issues. I think, and I'm sure that on the paper presenter and the policy presenter, they will mention a lot and much more detail than what I'm going to do in my few minutes of introduction. It has been a great pleasure for me to co-chair, this task force, and I would like to thank my co-chair for all their effort And I do hope next year somehow when the G20 will move to Italy, that we will still see each other and continue to work closely on such an important topic like the multilateralism, which has been almost an umbrella for all the other one. Because if we can fix the multilateralism, and if we can bring a better coordination and collaboration and more engaged in that one, I'm sure we will resolve a lot of the issues. Thank you very much. I look forward to listen to all the presentation today. I'll give you back, Bruno, to pass it on to the ambassador, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulaziz, for introducing the task force and for summarizing our journey. And now we are particularly pleased to welcome Ambassador Gianpiero Masolo to give the opening keynote on the future of multilateralism and global governance. Ambassador Masolo is the president of the Italian Institute for International Political Studies.
Thank you very much. Good morning, afternoon, good evening to everybody. I am very pleased to be able to speak in such an outstanding framework. I thank you very much, Dr. Al-Turki and the Secretariat of the Saudi T20 for the terrific job, and CPEC, that is our cohort here. I take the floor as chairman of ISPI. ISPI is the Italian National Coordinator for T20. And so we do hope that we will be able to follow up to the outstanding job of the Saudi chair in this framework. Of course, the challenge for the T20 is to be heard, to get to be heard by governments, because actually we are very brave and we are very experienced as think tanks, but we know, I think, through our national experiences that a think tank has value added only if it reaches out to the governments, it's capable to offer the governments viable political options. And so the whole scope of the T20 exercise is and should be exactly this one. I think that the Saudi chair managed quite well from this point of view. And I hope that the Italian chair will live up to the challenge and to the high standards that you set. Of course, our intention is to move in the framework that the past chairs have sketched for the T20. So it's a sense of continuity that is our aim. And of course, I can tell you from the outset that the Italian government, the future Italian G20 chair, is very much on the same page, continuity and emphasizing the outstanding topic of the international agenda. And among those, of course, as a matter of fact, the fact that the world has indeed a problem of governance is there, and it's something that is deeply felt, I think, by everybody. As we all know Ian Bremmer and his theory of the G0. Well, unfortunately, G0 is there. No effective rules of engagement, no effective settlements towards crises. The crises are multiplying themselves in a sort of geopolitical recession, once again, to cite Bremer, without the possibility of being solved. And the traditional tools that we had at our disposal, and first and foremost, the multilateral tools, not only seem inefficient for this purpose, to solve effectively world crises, but what is maybe worse is that they are increasingly perceived as inefficient. So the stakeholders are in a process of losing confidence in our multilateral tools. And this kind of process has been there since quite a long time, and COVID and the pandemic only added and made the situation more fragile from this point of view, and this is of course made the whole situation even worse. We may dwell here, but it will take us quite a long time. Why is it so? Well, we all know that it's partly linked to the crisis of the world liberal order, of the increasingly inward-looking leaderships, on this obsession to regain control, on the issues like my country first. All those factors are making multilateralism not riding high in the present moment of the international community. And nevertheless, I am convinced, ISPI is convinced, the Italian government is convinced that it is a bit too early to say that multilateralism is dead. Of course, maybe in the conception of world superpowers, I mean the superpowers that see their national interest in all the issues that are cross-cutting the international community, maybe they are tempted to have a multilateralism a la carte. But for all the other countries, we believe, multilateralism is still the only way to assess a meaningful role for all our countries in the international community. But if the multilateral tools, if the instrument, the multilateralism as a tool, stays unreformed, stays unchanged, stays not reinvented, well, then maybe we'll gather here next year or in a couple of years, really stating that multilateralism is dead. What of course we should avoid. But if you want to avoid, I think that T20 role is to give its contribution to try to sketch a possible path, a possible way to reinvent multilateralism. And maybe if we want, and this is my last consideration, if we want to reinvent multilateralism, we should encourage this switch from multilateral endeavors to multi-stakeholder endeavors. That is no longer just sovereign states, but all the components. Multilateralism should increasingly become a whole of a society, whole of a nation, whole of an international community with all its actors, statal and non-statal endeavor. And it's with this kind of ideas, with this kind of aim, that we will be glad to take over from the Saudi presidency. And I want once again to compliment the Saudi chair for the work in this direction that it has accomplished. Thank you very much to you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for these very insightful keynote. And I'm sure that the challenges of faith in multilateralism and the effectiveness of its institutions will be an important feature throughout this webinar, and your emphasis at the end of multi-stakeholder engagement will be an excellent bridge built to the first panel that we're going to listen to later, moderated by Helmut Anheier. So please bear with us in this matter. In the meantime, I'm very happy to hand over to Julia Pomares and Blair Shepard. Julia is the Task Force 5 co-chair and the executive director of CPEC, and Blair is a global leader of strategy and leadership at PwC.
Thank you, Bruno, and morning to everyone in Buenos Aires. It is, I think, day number 200 of quarantine in Buenos Aires, so very anxious times here in Argentina. But because of that, it's even more important to have this type of conversation. So very happy to be here and to have the possibility of this dialogue. Thank you to the Secretariat of the T20 to invite us to be part of this webinar. And it's a great honor to have this conversation with Blair Shepard. Blair, we started in 2 years ago, it seems like a long time, but it was only 2 years ago, a conversation on the future of politics. At that time, Helmut and Heyer, who is here today, Jenny Snower, and other colleagues from the T20, we were realizing that there was a lot of talk and conversations around the T20 on the future of work and automation and the impact of digital technology, but there was a lack of conversation about the future of politics and how all those changes in technology and all these changes in our capitalism were impacting on our multilateral institutions and actually in institutions more broadly. And we had great conversations at that point, and I remember two big debates. One was about the role of big corporations, whether they were going to increase their power vis-a-vis small companies and so vis-a-vis governments. And there was another big debate at that moment, I remember, about whether multilateral organizations were going to be able to cope with these big challenges. And now, 2 years later, we are in the middle of this nightmare, maybe an opportunity, not only a nightmare. It's difficult to see it at this point here in Buenos Aires, but hopefully an opportunity. And I think it's a good moment to have this kind of test of how institutions reacted during the pandemic, what was the role during these months, and what is going to be the role in the next months. And I'll give you my take from what we left debate at that moment. One is that we realized that big corporations were quite able to coordinate during these months. And actually, we're seeing a lot of coordination in the private sector, but at the same time, we weren't that clear about cooperation in the government area. We saw big cooperation at the regional level in the EU and the European Union, but we didn't see, I think, much cooperation or at least big ways in which they really got to what we needed to get in real time of cooperation between governments. And also, I think we are seeing that there is a lot of debate on multilateralism that is in the news actually every day that was quite absent in 2018, and maybe that it's good news. What is your take? Are institutions up to the promise or are failing during this moment of global mess?
So, Julia, as you know, before COVID occurred, there was real concern about where institutions working, right? And as you said, not just multilateral institutions, all institutions, both within countries and between countries. I think, to me, the interesting issue is if you look within country, is the dramatic variability around the world about how well institutions stood up, right? And so we should draw lessons from that. We should go look at the countries where actually they did the job really well and ones where they didn't, and what made them different. I think within multilaterals, I'm afraid the ambassador's right that at some level, it's almost as if 70 years of success has caused them to have governance structures and lack of speed and almost lack of focus, so they can't actually deal at the pace at which things are coming today, right? And COVID, in a way, is an extreme example, but there are many, many examples of issues or crises, as the ambassador articulated them, that actually we need to be much more rapid in response to, and the institutions aren't up to the task. And I think, Julia, there's maybe a few key reasons that are worth thinking about as we look to solutions. First one is the institutions were designed with the assumption there was a kind of single view of how the world should operate and how political economy should operate. And I think we just need to acknowledge that's no longer true and actually design for a more fractured world and in some ways embrace it and value that. And a sense, the notion that history is dead is kind of a scary thought in the world of social systems. So permitting variability and then learning how to navigate that variability, I think, is going to be increasingly important. Cherish it in a way. So to think about multilateralism, diversity as a construct for multilaterals. Second one, I think, is that because of the massive success we were having and the real success of multilaterals over the years, I think in some ways their mandate got too broad and they, in a sense, forgot their core mission. You can sort of look at budgets at many of the multilaterals and look at the number of things that we're working on. It was a lot. And, you know, one of the core lessons of strategy is that if you focus on everything, you get nothing done. And so in some ways, I think a piece of what we have to do is go back and say, why is the institution really here, right? What are the most important crises? What are the most important issues? And let's go focus on those for a while, right? And then I think the final one is we need a new kind of leader, right? In the sense of leaders need to be able to reconcile things that feel in contradiction to each other. So we need people who are really technically incredibly capable, but also social systems really capable. We need people who can navigate much more difficult political circumstances, but retain their integrity, right? And in some ways, we think about those as polar opposites, and we need some people who can step up and say, even if I'm a brilliant political scientist or systems thinker, I'm gonna learn technology because I know I need to. Even if I'm a double E, I'm gonna learn human systems because I know technology is affecting people in ways we don't want it to. And so we need to embrace, when I used to teach leadership, it was essentially play to strength. I think we need to now think about mitigating weakness in all of us as leaders. And it's a much tougher task, actually.
Definitely quite much more complicated. And you wrote your book on the 4 crises and 10 years to midnight, but you wrote that book before the pandemic, right?
Yes.
So, and one of those crises was the crisis of leadership. I think there were 4 crises: prosperity, technology, I think legitimacy of institutions and leadership. Yeah. And the focus at the beginning, I think, was on the first 2, prosperity and technology. And now we're seeing that we need to fix the crisis of leadership and institutions much faster than we thought, right? Do you think that this pandemic is speeding up those 10 years that we have to midnight? We need to get there before 2030. How do you think are these crises shaped by the pandemic?
I'm afraid we should have titled the book 8 Years to Midnight, actually, Julia, as you're saying. The thing I want to highlight in the 4 crises, and as was mentioned in the beginning, climate is one of those, right? That it's is that every year they're going to get worse, and so the heat will turn up. And after about a decade, they get really dark, right? So, Julia, if you think about it, you know, the forest fires that have happened around the world were bad last year, worse this year, but they worse next year, they'll be worse yet again. And then what eventually happens is there's insufficient forest and insufficient coral, so that in the country I grew up in, Canada and Russia, when they start releasing methane from the Arctic, there won't be anything to actually consume it. Will have destroyed the Earth's lungs, right? And that's a decade away. I think the institutional crisis is the same thing. The worry I have about institutions, there are 2 of the crises I think are existential. One of them is the crisis of technology, particularly climate. The second one, though, I think is institutions, because institutions are for people what water is for fish. We need to assume they exist. And if the legal system isn't working, if we don't trust the political system, we don't trust the education system, we don't trust multilateral institutions to deal through the things we need to on a global basis, then all of us step back and just question, how do I move today? How do I get on with it, right? And so they're unbelievably urgent. And I think what COVID did was just bring them faster. So think about sort of the other crisis technology, which is the technology we're working on and its unintended side effects. For me, we just accelerated progress to that world, right? And so it's more urgent than ever. I think the interesting thing about COVID, though, is it taught us two things that we should apply. One of them is humanity can do massive things fast. Right. So if I offered you a bet, Julia, before the crisis, the world will shut down the entire economy overnight, and I gave you 1,000 to 1 odds, you still wouldn't have taken that bet, right? But we did. Now, it turns out that wasn't a good massive fast thing. It was necessary, but we can go massively and fast. I think the second one is we discovered that there are some very few things that we truly, as humanity around the world, share in common. So if we could focus on a very few things, focus on addressing them really much faster than we ever thought about doing before, I think we could reinvigorate multilateral institutions.
Thank you, Blair. And when you're talking about institutions and when we are discussing multilateralism, we are also talking about business corporations, right? It's not just government institutions. And I was saying at the beginning, I think that it was quite also amazing to see big corporations coordinating to find some new ways in which using tracing apps and many things in which technology helped, and it's helping to solve this pandemic. Is your take that they feel now part of the solution of multilateralism? You think that there is a sense of business leaders of being part of what we need to get solved?
Yeah, I think so, Julia. I think the ambassador was right that essentially multilateralism has to be multi-stakeholder, and business is clearly one of the stakeholders. I think, to me, the interesting thing is, well, multilateralism was troubled over the last few years, and in some ways it showed that trouble during COVID. There was incredible international cooperation in certain areas, right? And so when we saw a need, we just got about doing it anyway, and we sort of forgot all the governance structures, right? So there's advice to the governance structures, which is two things really, is find ways to make yourself simpler, more expedited so you can move quickly. Don't lose the controls that governance implies, but design them so they're expeditious, right? And then the second one is focus on the things everyone really cares about and will come together. So in a sad part of the story you told, Julia, is we cooperated in spite of, not because of, in many cases, right? So let's figure out how to take that desire to cooperate and that notion we can move quickly and get business and government to work together. So I'm actually pleased, for example, with the UN Development Program and the framework they're trying to put together around bringing a kind of global framework to localize activity and bring business and government together. And actually civil society. I think that's the sort of form we need much more of in the future.
Thank you, Blair. And there were very interesting contributions to this task force this year about multi-stakeholder approaches and how to reinvent multilateralism and the ways in which we are thinking about it. I think we are on time now. I don't know, Blair, you have a final thought to share. Otherwise, I'll give the mic back to Bruno to keep with a very busy program this morning. Well, this morning here, but this afternoon for many of you.
So the last thought, if I can, is I agree entirely with the introductory remarks that we need to get multilateral institutions working again as quickly as we can and recognize all the challenges of making that happen because the world does not have long. My biggest anxiety is we're talking about what we need to do at a time when we do not have the time to do that. We have to just do. Because the crisis, seriously, the 4 crises we identify in the book, 10 years from now, the world goes really dark and human systems don't change that fast. So we have to stop talking and start doing. And that's I beg of all of you that that's what we focus on during the T20 and the G20. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair, and thank you, Bruno, for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. So let's move so we get acting soon.
Thank you, Julia and Blair, for this fascinating conversation. And with these, grim but also motivating and somewhat encouraging final remarks, Blair, I would like to move on and now also circling back to what both you, Julia and Blair emphasized, as well as what the ambassador earlier said, thinking about the role of multi-stakeholder multilateralism, so to speak. And thereby I would like to introduce the first panel of the day under the title Global Challenges and Cooperation, the Role of the G20 and Multilateral Stakeholders. It will be moderated by Helmut Anheier, who is a Task Force 5 co-chair and professor of sociology at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And on the panel will speak 4 members of our task force: Hugo Dobson, a professor of Japan's international relations at the University of Sheffield; Dennis Görlich, the head of the Global Challenges Center at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy; Marie Luomi, an independent expert based in the UAE; and Hans Born, the assistant director at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, DCAF. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And this is Helmut Anheier from the Hertie School in Berlin and the Luskin School at UCLA. We have an exciting and very thoughtful panel here this afternoon. All of the panelists have written policy briefs. We are not asking them to summarize these policy briefs, but what we did is pose questions to them, which they could now relate to in the context of the policy brief they have written. I will read those questions to you and then turn it over to the first panelist, which is Hugo. And Hugo will be followed by Dennis, Mari, and then Hans. That's the order in which they are in the program. So let me read the 4 questions that we pose to the panelists. They have 5 minutes each to address them. They will address 1, 2, or 3, or all of them. We left it open. So the first question is, how can the G20 improve its engagement with non-state actors? Reference here, for example, the shrinking space for civil society, or the fact that Amnesty International just announced it is leaving India. Second, what role can the G20 take in relation to existing multilateral actors and agreements such as WHO and the SDG in general, given the current geopolitical environment and that hardly anybody noticed the 75th anniversary of the United Nations? Third, how can the G20 contribute to enhancing global commitments? Think about positive and negative sanction. How can it avoid free riding and cherry picking? Finally, how can the G20 avoid being affected by growing US-China rivalries and remain a neutral multilateral actor? You will see that these questions follow very nicely from the debate we just listened to with Julia Pomaris and Blair Shepherd. So I would like Hugo to open the debate.
Great, thank you very much, Helmut, and greetings from sunny Sheffield on day 201 since lockdown began in the UK. In our policy brief, Ronja Scheller of the Kerber Institute and I first and foremost addressed the question of how the G20 can improve its engagement with a range of stakeholders. But we also touch upon the questions that Helmut mentioned of how the G20 can enhance its own global commitments and occupy the position of a neutral multilateral actor, rolling with the punches resulting from growing rivalries between its members. We argue that the challenge faced by the G20 is that despite a proven record of multi-stakeholder and non-state actor engagement, this engagement has been ad hoc, limited in scope, vague in terms of impact, and inconsistent as regards results. If the G20 continues in this vein, especially at a time when a growing global governance gap is emerging, despite collective action being needed the most, it runs the risk of atrophy, ineffectiveness, illegitimacy, irrelevance, and running the risk of sounding too apocalyptic here, terminal decline. There is a lot to play for here, but the good news is that the G20 is in a strong position to preempt these developments thanks to its flexible and non-bureaucratic formats, as well as its accumulated experience of engagement with non-state actors. So we call for a systematic reconsideration and review of the G20's multi-stakeholder engagement and its consultative processes. In the policy brief, we make three broad proposals. We think the G20 should take these consultative processes seriously. It should consider the whole of the policy cycle, and it should walk the talk when it comes to multi-stakeholder cooperation. In particular, the following concrete measures are critical. As regards taking consultative processes seriously, the G20 should conduct an honest and rigorous audit of its existing engagement groups, working groups, and other stakeholder platforms. This audit should be outsourced to an organization like the OECD that has a track record in assisting the work of the G20. And the goal would be to establish a level playing field by enhancing existing platforms, strengthening synergies, eliminating duplication and redundant dialogues, and establishing new ones where necessary. Consideration should also be given to the creation of highly focused task and finish groups for specific pressing global governance challenges, such as COVID-19. We suggest that a symbolic first step would be inviting representatives of engagement groups to the G20 Leaders Summit next month. At the very least, the summit should in the future dedicate space on its agenda to integrate the proposals from these engagement groups. As regards considering the whole of the policy cycle, in order to make the most of multi-stakeholder cooperation, we recommend establishing the timeframes in which different stakeholders can provide their input most effectively. Civil society organizations have traditionally been considered potential pressure groups to push governments into action, but they're also active in implementing policy, acting as service providers, building capacity, transferring knowledge, and setting norms. They could also play an important role in improving the ongoing monitoring of G20 commitments. But we should not ignore the fact that we currently operate in an international system that draws its legitimacy from its state-centric character. Governments are and will remain the only actors who can legitimately craft and oversee the implementation of global policies. We need platforms that recognize this reality, but are empowered to coordinate the magnitude of non-state actors that contribute to global governance. One such platform could be a modest, and I stress modest, G20 Secretariat. This would be an expression of the continuing centrality of states and play a role in our proposed audit. Thereafter, it can serve as a nucleus for non-state actors from G20 countries that contribute in some way to the G20's work. It is paramount for the G20 to maintain its traditional strengths of informality and flexibility, but a light touch secretariat would provide the institutional capacity needed for addressing global challenges efficiently, sustainably, and jointly. It could manage logistics for future summits, ensuring continuity in outreach and engagement, as well as in summit documentation and commitments. It could serve as an interim repository where key documents and information could be stored and act as a docking station for non-state actors involved in G20 initiatives. A non-G20 country like Singapore, with a well-trained diplomatic cadre and strong interest in engagement through the G20 in its leadership role of the global governance group, could provide the neutral setting that we need at this time of rivalry. In terms of walking the talk, we place the emphasis on the overlooked role of language, which can be an unconscious but considerable barrier to meaningful interaction. The G20 should review the smorgasbord of membership statuses it uses, like guest, permanent guest, and permanent observer, which only serve to exclude and alienate. An updated nomenclature should ensure that all groups are reflected as having a stake in G20 affairs. It shouldn't be up to non-state actors to have to speak the language of the G20. The G20 should reconsider its own use of language in its communications, with a greater onus on empathy with the perspectives and experience of non-state actors. In addition, one issue that has characterized the G20 and its engagement groups is the avalanche of recommendations and documents that are, to quote Macbeth, full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. Brevity is a virtue, and the G20 and its engagement groups should take the lead of last year's G7 summit in Biarritz by issuing a brief one-page executive summary of discussions and decisions. Finally, we recommend that the G20 consider the flexible use of social compacts to act as non-legally binding multi-stakeholder arrangements, tying together governmental authorities and relevant non-state actors in relationships to shape expectations and build confidence. The UN Global Compact can serve as a useful template, and evidence suggests that these social compacts possess considerable symbolic value. If the G20 succeeds in making multi-stakeholder cooperation an integral part of its operating system, it could once again reinforce its role as one of the most effective and efficient platforms for global policy making. And this will in turn enhance faith in multilateralism at a time when it is needed most. Thank you.
Hugo, thank you. You twice over your allotted time, so I have to cut you short here. Yeah. Thank you so much for your concrete proposals. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start a little bit broader and I mean, telling you what you all know. Namely, I think that the COVID pandemic has really put a spotlight on how interdependent the world has become, and also how fragile many of the achievements can be that we have made. Inequalities are increasing again. Trust, I think, is very important, has been eroded between countries. International cooperation was questioned, but of course, multilateral cooperation was under fire before too. Nationalist leaders, emerging trade conflicts, and people no longer really believing in the type of globalization that in particular the G20 countries have promoted for a number of years, and rightly so. They no longer believed in it. Also, the governance architecture in general did not work really well anymore. It wasn't fit for the interdependent economies that we have now, global value chains. New economic powers have emerged. And there's a new digital world that is largely ungoverned, I think. No global consensus is there on how we exchange data and how we regulate digital enterprises across the world. So what we really need to do here is, I think, to kind of shape a world that's better prepared for those things: digital trade, data transfer, skepticism towards globalization, global value chains, and also one that is able to deal with emergencies like the pandemics or, importantly, climate change too. Now, in the policy brief that I've written with a colleague, which is called Reinvigorating Multilateral Cooperation During the COVID Crisis, we sort of address the question what role the G20 takes in relation to other multilateral actors and agreements, and where it has some scope for initiating change, what it can do, not really what it cannot do, but this is up for the next project, I think. So we've looked into the past 12 years of the G20, looked through a lot of literature, in fact, and thereby we thought about what the G20 can really do. And we think that it can really do three things. It can be a supplier of top-level political impetus, and I'll discuss in a minute what we mean by that. It can be a norm setter.
You have 2 minutes left. I should say 2 minutes left, right?
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes left, 2 or 3 minutes.
A norm setter and a policy initiator. Now, the supplier of top-level political impetus, we mean that it can support global agreements like the Paris Agreement. It can initiate the reform of international institutions. It can prioritize problems. The norm setter means that it can really decide on joint principles and deliver some broad ideas on how national domestic policy making should be done. For example, macroprudential policies or the standstill agreement on protectionism after the financial crisis. And it can be a policy initiator because it has some delegative quality. It cannot really, the G20 as such cannot implement policies, but it can delegate, for example, the 25 by 25 on gender equality agreement, the base erosion and profit shifting initiative by the OECD, the AI principles. So in having said that, we think that the G20 really is an enabler here, and that it has a very important role, in fact, in shaping the post-COVID world. It is particularly, we think, its norm-setting capacity is extremely important, because when we kind of rebuild economies now after the massive crisis, we can really have a chance here with the help of the G20 to have a human-centered framework and environmentally friendly, sustainable economies. The SDGs are important here and can help as a guidance and as a North Star for that recovery. And it's really, I think, the G20 in these discussions with their norm-setting power and supplier of impetus and policy initiating power that can make a difference here.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for impeccable timing. And let's move on to our next panelist, and that's Masolo. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Helmut. Climate change has been brought up a few times already, so that's what our paper focused on. We looked specifically at ways in which the G20 can support the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and global governance more broadly. I co-authored this brief with colleagues Jen Allen and Rishi Bandari, with whom I've covered and observed the international climate negotiations for the past decade. And it's out of this experience and frustration also that this paper came up. The UNFCCC is an essential part of a very complex governance landscape on climate change. It enjoyed high legitimacy along with its Paris Agreement, and it has a near universal membership. However, there are major and increasing question marks around its ability to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees. So enter the G20. That's the source of 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And Helmut had questions for us. Your first two were, how could the G20 support a multilateral stakeholder like the UNFCCC? And how could it contribute to enhancing global commitments in this area? We identified 4 ways that enable countries to raise ambition in ways that does not require a 100% consensus, given the spirit of the times. The first one is opt-in climate clubs. This has been talked about since at least the 2009 Copenhagen climate meeting. A group of G20 countries could coalesce around a specific goal, such as a temperature target, or, for example, harmonizing and linking their emission trading schemes. There would be need for some benefits for members, of course, to encourage others to join as they're ready to do so. Another area would be cooperative work for trade-exposed sectors. This would bring together industries from across the G20 to address competitiveness concerns and design green recoveries. Areas of coordination here could include common standards, harmonizing regulation, and technology collaboration. The 2 other areas we identified are an informal signaling mechanism for Paris Agreement pledges, also known as NDCs, and mainstreaming climate change across G20 communiques. As we know, the next UN climate conference is at least a year away from now still. And since March, multilateral environmental diplomacy has been in a state of paralysis. This is truly a crisis. So platforms like G20 that bring together an important number of players and still operate should really be putting climate change and ambition raising at the core of their agenda. Now, in terms of mainstreaming climate change, it's been rather disappointing so far, to be honest. The recent Energy Ministers' communique, for example, does not make references to climate change or inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And it remains silent about the opportunities of combining COVID recoveries with energy transitions that are aligned with Paris Agreement and climate science. So these are huge lost opportunities. Now, Helmut had a question on US-China rivalry. I would put it slightly differently in the context of climate governance, because here the challenge has been a lack of leadership among major emitters rather than rivalry in recent years. The US and China together account for 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and their agreement largely underpinned the success of the 2015 Paris Agreement. However, the US has been backtracking from this agreement in recent years, and therefore everybody was waiting for China to wait and see through the elections before it might put on the table a new goal. Now, this didn't happen. At the recent UNGA, Chinese leader Xi Jinping announced a carbon neutrality before 2060 target, which is truly momentous. And the observation here I want to make is that from a geopolitical perspective, there's now a clear change in the dynamics, where China, the other key player, is no longer prioritizing historical responsibility in its climate change policy at the international level. It rather seems to consider climate action as a tool for economic competitiveness. So I see here a change in dynamic, which creates opportunities for the G20 also through these coalitions of willing that I was talking about. And then very briefly, on the final question of non-state actors and engaging them, we made 2 recommendations. The first relates to the Urban 20 engagement group, which currently include cities. We are recommending strengthening it and also broadening its scope to regions. There are regions such as California, which are among the top 10 economies in the world, and we would call this the sub-20. The second area was to establish a permanent dialogue with the V20 group, which is a platform for the world's 50 most climate vulnerable countries. This would ensure these countries' voices are integrated into G20 discussions, and it would also help strengthen the message on the crucial need to align financial assistance to these countries with social justice and with climate resilience, which is particularly relevant in today's context. And that's it. Thank you. Thanks, Helmut.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, last but not least, we have Hans, born from Geneva.
Thank you very much, Helmut. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. Thank you. So first of all, many thanks to the excellent work of the G20 chair in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, particularly to Dr. Abdulaziz Sagar and his team for really supporting this in an excellent way. We owe him a lot, and we can only hope that Italy will do an as good job as Saudi Arabia did, and we in Geneva and DCAP, we will be ready to support also next year's initiatives. So coming to the questions, you had Helmut raise 3 questions, and we can address 3 out of 4 of them, which is engagement with non-state actors, strengthening multilateral actors and agreements, global commitments. I will illustrate this now on the basis of the policy brief that we have done, which is called At the Interface of Security and Development, Addressing Fragility Through Good Governance of the Security Sector. So our main pitch is that the future of multilateralism and global governance rests on the realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals and the Twin Sustaining Peace Resolution. However, there are great challenges at the moment to the implementation, and progress is very slow and even more endangered now during the COVID-19 crisis. So hard-earned development gains are lost currently, particularly in the context of fragile contexts, and also countries which are plagued by conflict and violence. So this policy brief, and this is also an answer to your question, Helmut, would call for the group of 20, the leaders of the group of 20, to curb the ensuing stall development and to look at good governance-driven security sector engagement, so to address fragility and conflict. And why is this the case? Why do we think this is important? I will first say the big problems that needs to be fixed, and then our solutions. So we see that, and that is confirmed by the UN World Bank seminal study on pathways to peace, that the biggest obstacle to development is fragility, conflict, and violence. So the G20 is normally dealing with development and trade and economics, but we can forget about all that if there is violence and conflict and fragility. So I think this paper is the first one in its long history that addresses fragility, and I think it is long overdue, but because where there is violence, where there is conflict, and where there is fragility, we cannot achieve development. So this is a very important thing, and we can also see that half of the world's poor now people live currently in situations and countries characterized by fragility. So, and these are characterized by grievances, violations of human rights, lots of risk factors that businesses cannot thrive, and also very fragile states in institutions. So we think that it is high time that the G20 think about how these challenges can be met. And so our main proposition is that it would be, fragility should be addressed by governance-driven approaches to fragility, governance-driven approaches to security. So we don't think here about tanks and weapons and all that, but about accountable police services, strong parliamentary oversight, strong grievances systems, protection for civil society organizations. So everything that characterizes good governance of security. This is very necessary, and we think that, so therefore, that the G20 should have a holistic view of public sector reform, of which security is part. So not only to look at transport, not only to look at education, but to include security in this, because otherwise it will be very difficult to achieve anything at all. So the second part of our solution is that the G20 could set up a forum, and this is my last point, to set up a forum to discuss good practices that states have on how to improve good governance of the security sector. And such a forum should be a multi-stakeholder process with civil society, states, think tanks. Thank you very much, and I apologize if I was a little bit over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, you were not over time at all, Hans. You were perfect in your timing, but apologies for having to cut you off at the end, because we have to close at in about a minute sharp to make room for the next session. So let me thank you all for participating in this panel. We had a number of very, very concrete proposals, and I hope people took note of them, and hopefully we also have some action following. Let me turn it back to Bruno, who will guide us through the rest of the afternoon. Thank you so much again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Helmut and Hugo, Dennis, Mary, and Hans for this fascinating discussion. And I can see that advancing the discussion on multilateral stakeholders really will stick with us through the afternoon. Now, turning to the next session, it is my pleasure to introduce a novelty to your Task Force 5 webinar, which is the presentation of a Saudi artwork that incorporates and reflects on our task force themes. And art is a universal language, transcending barriers of language and time, and T20 uses art to communicate its themes, priorities, and policy recommendations to all. It is therefore now my pleasure to introduce Nujud Al-Sudairi, who is a Saudi artist and a multidisciplinary artist, in fact, based in Riyadh. Her art and architecture is focused on researching socioeconomic urban themes in contemporary culture. She further explores and develops her findings by weaving textiles to create artworks that are rooted within themes of gender and identity, reflecting her own experiences. The artwork that she is going to present is called Disa Valley, and she has created a multilateral 3D dimension art made of textiles that look within and out. Each knot in this art represents the link and relationship between multilateralism and global governance, so to speak. Therefore, we are now watching the video of this art piece.
The artwork is entitled Disa Valley. Disa is a valley north of Saudi, northeast, where many women still continue this practice of weaving, and it's a communal practice. It's a community sort of driven practice. The idea of weaving into a radial form really had to do with kind of the complexities of the site in Disa, and looking into kind of the layers. I tried to sort of echo that sort of multifaceted kind of dimension inside Disa. Everything around us is technically fabric. Sort of how each individual piece interweaves with each other and interacts to create a very secure fabric is almost a metaphor for how things operate on a larger scale. Governance is very important in generating policies that affect sort of the industry as a whole. whether it's art industries, whether it's architecture industries, having this inter-exchange between artist or architect or researcher and sort of decision makers is very important in fast-tracking sort of a more sustainable method of development and growth. Recent government has contributed so much in how I operate as both an artist, as an architect, as a researcher, or a person who just observes sort of the social woven structure as a whole. I think it's inseparable. My main source of inspiration, my main context that I work from is this country and this setting and this landscape.
We are fortunate that Nujud is going to join us now and going to present her work in person, online obviously. She's going to speak in Arabic. However, there will be interpretation available. You should be able to see in a minute on the bottom on the right-hand side a button where you can switch the interpretation to English if you wish.
Assalamu alaikum jami'an. I wasn't sure if this was my cue. Assalamu alaikum. It's an honor to be with you all today. I will be explaining sort of my work in Arabic. Apologies for the non-speakers. عملي بعنوان الديسة أو وادي الديسة هو نشأ من بحث في تاريخ السدو كصناعة كبراكتس نشأ من حاجة معمارية actually. العمل يختص بالناسجات اللي في هذيك المنطقة. النسيج ككل يحكي ممكن نشرحها كأنها metaphor almost كثير من الممارسات الحالية اللي نراها. فارتبطت مفاهيم كثيرة في العمل بالحوكمة أو التعددية في أو التعددية في الصناعة أو صناعة القرار وما إلى ذلك. أعتذر عن الأذان في الباك جراوند. فنشأ العمل كبحث ثم تحول إلى أنا أصنع محور على هذا الموضوع. وعملي في الحقيقة هو ينظر إلى البيئة اللي في الديسة والممارسات اللي حرفية والفنية في هذا النطاق. فكما تعرفون السدو هو أصلاً شعار G20 هذه السنة، لكن نشأ من حاجة إلى خلق مساحة. وهذا مش تاريخ من زمان، إلى الآن في ممارسات مهمة جدا في هذه المناطق. فإذا نظرنا إلى التكوين البيئي للمنطقة والتكوين الفني للعاملين في هذه الصناعة، نرى ترابط كثير في الأمرين. وللأسف صناعة النسيج ككل هي حرفة almost نقدر نقول إنها يعني تمشي نحو الاندثار بسبب صعوبتها التقنية وعدم مشاركة الممارسات هذه بين الأجيال. فصناعة النسيج ككل مهمة جدا في كمان أخذنا إلى موضوع أن دائما ننسى صناعة الشخص أو الإنسان في الكل. فكيف نتقدم إلى المستقبل بصناعات أكبر ومجالات مختلفة، ننسى أننا نضع الإنسان في عين الاعتبار في larger context. فكنت أتمنى أن هذا العمل جدا بسيط، وأنا فخورة أنه كان كثير ناس وجدوا ترابط بين أفكار أكبر وأوسع. لكن هو بالأخير يعني يقدر يختصر أتوقع في 3 subjects اللي هي البيئة، الإنسان، التاريخ والصناعات المشتركة أو الممارسات المشتركة. فما أبغى أطول عليكم، لكن ما أعرف هل في مجال الأسئلة أو هل do we end the sort of intro here?
Thank you very much for this fascinating insights. We have, in fact, 1 or 2 minutes, but so far I don't see any question in the chat. To answer the question below, the video of Nujud's presentation will be available online on the T20 YouTube channel. And I have to say, I was very intrigued by this link between cultural practices, the human nature, history, and then the structures of global governance. So thank you very much for this fascinating insight and really novel experience for me, and I guess for many others too, to integrate art into this Zoom meeting on global governance and the future of multilateralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. شكرا لكم. Thank you, everyone.
We are now turning to the next panel, the second panel, on legitimacy, sustainability, and trust, reforming the G20 to safeguard the benefits of globalization. Natalie Tocci, Task Force 5 co-chair and director of the IAI and special advisor to EU High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, is going to be moderating the session, and she will be joined by Bernardo Venturi, a senior fellow at IAI as well, Maha Akil, a senior member at the ASPA Forum, Shafi Aldama, the chairman of the Department of Global Social Studies at King Fahd University of Petroleum Minerals, and Homi Kharas, senior fellow, Global Economy and Development at the Brookings Institution.
Well, thank you, Bruno, for that introduction, and a very warm welcome from me. It's a triple pleasure for me to chair this panel today. Firstly, as Bruno was as he introduced me as co-chair of this task force on multilateralism of the T20, the Saudi presidency of the T20. As the next year, where indeed I really do hope, and I'm sure that multilateralism will continue to be a defining feature of our work, and where indeed much of the work that has been conducted this year in the course of this task force will indeed be fed into the work that we will be continuing next year as part of our work for the T20. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, because here I am chairing an absolutely stellar panel. Bruno has introduced them, so given the limited time that we have available, I will not go through the list again. And let me just jump straight into the content. Now, the way in which, as indeed the previous panel and the next panel has been organized, the way in which we decided to organize this panel, rather than going through the fantastic policy briefs that our authors have produced, which are publicly available, to really try and sort of get to the heart of some of the main themes that emerge in their papers, and in which indeed are some of the defining themes characterizing the challenges and the opportunities underpinning multilateralism, both in the context of the G20 and of course more broadly. And of course, even pre-COVID-19, there was a sort of big debate brewing over questions of the legitimacy and the inclusivity and the general sort of openness and sustainability, not only of multilateralism as a solution, but of interdependence and in a sense as the stuff, yeah, that generates the need for multilateralism. And a lot of this had been, as I said, questioned pre-COVID, the general sort of, essentially the sort of, the questioning of globalization, of interdependence, because of the inequalities that it gave rise to, has given rise to, and basically because of a lack of sufficient inclusivity, which of course then led to a questioning of not only the legitimacy and the sustainability of the international system as we knew it. And this, as we know, spilled into and has been spilling into a challenging and a challenge to multilateralism as such. Now, in many respects, all this has accelerated in and over the course of this pandemic. We know that there are pushes towards deglobalization, towards renationalization, the debate over reshoring, over nearshoring, the debate over critical supplies, the race for vaccines. I'm not going to go through the long list again, but very clearly this does pose a challenge, an extra challenge to multilateralism. And it's clear that if multilateralism is to survive and to thrive as a defining feature of the 21st century, some of those core questions concerning legitimacy, sustainability, and inclusivity have to be tackled. So let me now perhaps begin by turning to Bernardo, who has worked particularly on the question of inclusion, particularly thinking about the African continent. If you, Bernardo, could give us a couple of minutes' thoughts on how you see these questions.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks a lot to the organizer for conveying this appointment. It's a great pleasure to discuss with you all today on possible reforms of the G20 in terms of legitimacy, sustainability, and trust. Indeed, as Natalie, as you said, I do think that it's crucial to strengthen the G20's inputs to legitimacy by expanding its reach towards more structural engagement of non-member states and regional organizations. It's therefore essential to boost its role as a pivotal institution platform, and thus consolidating a hub and spoke structure with the G20 at its center. Therefore, to ensure a greater input legitimacy, the G20 will have to develop a more structured approach to engaging global public goods with a broad range of actors who fall outside the G20 membership. And indeed, this is a crucial point, how to involve external actors to increase legitimacy and inclusivity. In this sense, the G20 could become a platform to organize informal dialogues, bringing together experts from the engagement groups, the G20, and Africa policymakers to discuss reforms. As we know, in the G20, the only African country right now is South Africa, but it's a huge continent with 55 countries, so it's really important to have different stakeholders from Africa involved. The assumption here is that the African and European partners sit in a key position to facilitate this kind of development. They share key global challenges such as climate change, as discussed before, and public health. A concrete proposal is that the European G20 members, South Africa, and the African Union will establish a series of informal G20 dialogues to explore various options for the future of multilateralism in a changing global order, as we described before. Such an initiative will also increase the G20 legitimacy by enhancing its inclusivity in ideas generation and agenda setting. The informality will be important to ensure a free flow of ideas, not constrained by concerns around national positioning, which often marks more formal multilateral setting. So again, why should European and African actors play such a convening role within the G20? While both the EU and the African Union are committed to sustaining, reforming, and strengthening the rules-based global order, and the G20 can provide a solid platform for this work. the G20 could act as a legitimating and catalyzing coalition, possibly together with other developing economies, both inside formal and informal G20 meetings and beyond. With this goal in mind, African and European stakeholders participating in G20 could convene those actors still formally excluded from the forum, such as the African Union itself or the African Development Bank, so as to gather their proposal, especially on public health, unfolding debt relief efforts, and the exchange of best practices and experiences to cope with the pandemic. I'll leave it here and open to further discuss later on.
Thank you, Bernardo. Before I turn to Maha, perhaps a quick follow-up question concerning in particular the way you would see the role of South Africa as you were mentioning, in a sense, in many respects, the sort of the link between these two, the G20 and the African Union.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Natalie. South Africa is already playing this role and is not staying the G20 only as a country itself, but is playing the role of a hub for other African countries. We can see that within the T20 mechanism as well, with the African Standing Group. So with the South African and the European think tanks, also as IAI, gathering the ideas from the African partners and European partners and discussing together. So South Africa is already playing this kind of role. And I do think that that country is in a leading position at the regional level in South Africa as a region, as a continental level and globally. So they do play this important role, and also with these leadership, they can play an important role in the pandemic response as well.
Thanks, Bernardo. Maha, let me turn to you now to reflect on these questions, but also perhaps to hear your thoughts on some of the points also that Bernardo was raising, and in particular this question of sort of inclusivity as enlargement and the extent to which there is, because in many respects one could say, well, the G20 itself is already, sort of has extended the legitimacy of, that is missing, for instance, in other multilateral formats such as the G7, by enlarging, by being more inclusive. Now, of course, the counter argument to Bernardo's point, which is not about obviously a further enlargement of the G20, but of a sort of perhaps hub and spoke approach of the G20 reaching out to other world regions, is the question mark as to whether this could perhaps certainly increase inclusivity, but detract from effectiveness. I mean, perhaps this is also something that I may come back to with Homi in particular. So if you could perhaps reflect on also some of these themes, and in particular, how you see them affect the quest, the broader thematic quest for sustainability.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the organizers and for this opportunity. Well, as you know, like as has been mentioned in this webinar, some of the multilateral international organizations have become too big, and they have such huge mandates, and sometimes they don't have the resources to implement and to follow up. And at the same time, you don't want to be too narrow on your scope and too small where you are not inclusive, as mentioned here before, and to benefit from all the different experiences, especially at the local level, regional level, where you have strengths in knowing the local cultures, the local economy, the way things are run at a particular country or region. So in this regard, you know, the COVID-19, as much as it has proven or has shown you know, we could say the ineffectiveness or inability of a single country or single organization to tackle a crisis. At the same time, it also showed and proved the need for cooperation and coordination of different efforts, of different institutions, of different organizations. So this is where the G20 can play a role, and as Bernardo just said, to be a platform for being inclusive, for coordinating the different efforts. And in the paper that I presented, I proposed having steering committees at the G20, where each steering committee can tackle a specific crisis. For example, if it is the COVID-19, where the members will be members of the G20 countries, as well as non-G20 countries that are most affected by the crisis. And at the same time, to benefit from the experiences and the resources of international organizations and the know-how and the expertise of local and regional organizations, and to also engage local communities, civil society, international NGOs, to tap into their resources and their expertise in handling a particular crisis. So basically, the G20, it is not this proposal. It's not just within the G20 countries. Through these steering committees, we can be more inclusive and engage other organizations, other countries that are not members of the G20 in order to enhance coordination and be make better use of the resources available and the expertise.
So Maha, I mean, to sort of, you know, get to in a sense, a practical example of this proposal in a manner that, in a sense, relates to us as T20, for instance. How would such a steering committee, for instance, aimed at outreach to other world regions, but in particular as regards civil society or the think tank community? How exactly would that work in terms of the way in which the G20, with its various B's and C's and T's and Y's, sort of, I mean, how would that setup fit into the steering committee proposal that you would be making?
Well, thank you for that question. There's a main steering committee of members that will not be too large, but of countries and organizations that are directly involved in the issue, if we're talking about COVID-19. And at the same time, each of these members would be able to coordinate with other organizations and local and regional organizations, as well as other countries within their specific expertise. For example, if it is a WHO, as a member of the steering committee, they would have the ability to coordinate with the international NGOs such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi, and others, as well as some pharmaceutical companies that are working on research and things like that to develop the way and the methodology to go ahead with the vaccine. At the same time, financial organizations such as the World Bank would also coordinate with and engage with regional organizations, financial organizations, philanthropists, other sources that can contribute to the funding of the efforts to tackle the issue. So there's one steering committee, but at the same time, each member of the steering committee would have the ability to coordinate with and engage with other organizations at the regional level, engage with countries that are not members of the G20, etc.
Thank you so much, Maha. And let me now turn to Shafi and perhaps ask him again in reflecting on some of the main insights from his brief, also to perhaps steer the conversation. I mean, I think both Bernardo and Maha really put the finger on different ways and means to address the inclusivity, in a sense, the inclusivity legitimacy nexus set of questions. Perhaps also to make the transition or to enlarge the pie to tackle more head-on questions of sustainability. Shafi, let me turn to you perhaps to highlight some of your main insights and proposals.
Sure, thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and good afternoon, everyone. But first, before answering this question, I would like to thank Dr. Fahad Turki and his colleague, Dr. Abdulaziz bin Sagar, and his colleague at this task force, and the entire 220 Saudi Arabia team for the wonderful journey over the last 9 months. We really, as a researcher, enjoyed at most. Also, I would like to congratulate everyone for the success of the T20 Saudi Arabia. Coming back to your question, I would like also to bring some point from the proposal that we put forward, that sustainability and the progress of globalization cannot be looked at through multilateral organization unless we do have a strong multilateralism, or indeed we have something to put an organization such as the G20 all together. The G20 as the example, and actually the concentration of our policy brief is a very good example. I mean, started with the financial in 1999. It became, in our opinion, more into the political economy and more into politics since 2008 when the leaders take over. So the historic path of the organization was going through some kind of political economy journey, let's say, and we do believe that there are something that are missing, especially when it comes to the internal, let's say, reform of the organization itself or the institution. I mean, we do believe there is a lack for internal cooperation that is direct, where it's bring into the mutual benefit for each state. We believe that the G20 can be more successful in its efforts for the advancement of globalization that would be accessible for everyone if it can strengthen the economy and the cooperation and the mutual interest of its own member. And this is where we bring about the Sovereign Wealth Fund platform that will raise the cooperation between the G20 states as it will be accessible for the whole. I mean, they could together increase wealth, develop key economic sector, strengthening their economic cooperation, and obviously their political ties. The platform that we are proposing is working through some of the events that is, let's say, to some extent is slowing globalization. Some would think so, such as the COVID-19. I mean, COVID-19 need get together form in order to work there together. Also, we do believe that the lacking there is, let's say, the exchange of best practice between the member. If you have a platform such as the one we are putting there, it will give them a space for more into, let's say, exchange of best practice, and also of involving some, let's say, a kind of economic and a profitable investment that could convince the public and could convince the state that they are on stake into this. I would stop here and just go for your other question.
You're mute, Natalie.
Sorry. Extremely interesting, Shafi. Thanks so much for that. And I think you sort of point in, through your brief in a very interesting direction, meaning that ultimately, if multilateralism is to stick, and therefore, if it is to increase its perceived legitimacy, it is something that has to deliver, and it has to deliver concrete public goods. And often to deliver concrete public goods, resources are necessary, and therefore also the idea of a linkage with the sovereign wealth platform, I think, is an extremely interesting example. But perhaps it's a sort of short follow-up question to you on this. If you could, in a sense, provide, one or two concrete examples of what kind of investments in what kind of areas could come about through this kind of cooperation.
Thank you for the question. Well, across the board. I mean, now most of these sovereign wealth funds are investing individually, and they go with sometime high risk in such an area. And for our proposal, we would like them, I mean, it's absolutely free. I mean, do not think that our proposal will tie the sovereign wealth fund from any kind of investment they do. It's the opposite. It would help them actually to go across the board. But sometimes, in some situation, there are cases that cannot be solved by one sovereign wealth fund or one country. A clear example is the vaccination of COVID-19. I mean, some of the country now, some of the state are investing highly on this, Russian, for example, and the other. But if you get, let's say, 3 of those already we are proposing in the platform, they can get together and they can really invest in the already built company that are capable of, I mean, across the board, not just in one certain country, and who can bring that up. Also, we do believe the artificial intelligence, the technology sector, and also the infrastructure that will bring, for example, a pipeline project and so on. So there is so many. The question is not what. The question is there are quite a lot that are ready, especially for those sovereign wealth to get with. Besides, I mean, if they get together through a platform that is not and will not tighten, it will give them more freedom. And in fact, now some of the sovereign wealth fund cannot invest in certain kind of investment in another country because of the barrier to the investment, because of the sensitivity, whatever you call it. But now, if they get together, they can do this. They can do this very well, and they can do this with the best, let's say, exchange of practice, discussion between all the group. So to answer your question in short, there is so many to do, and we do believe that if they set up this platform, it will help them quite a lot.
Thank you very much, Shafi, and I think this is a fantastic example that highlights how, if you like, coming together adds up to more than the sum of the parts, because as I think some of the examples that you were highlighting there really do demonstrate how indeed through a common platform of this kind, there would be investments that individually, and this goes beyond the availability of resources, but individually sovereign wealth funds would not be able to do. And by doing it together, it would also be a very tangible proof of what is it that multilateralism can deliver. Now, this allows me to make a sort of very smooth transition onto Homi, who has, I think, made in his brief a very powerful argument about, in order for multilateralism to be perceived as being legitimate, it has to be clear what is it that multilateralism has to do, as well as what is it that multilateralism does not have to do. Because indeed there is, in a sense, a sort of principle of subsidiarity that we as Europeans are very much attuned to, because it's one of the main principles underpinning, for instance, European integration, which also in and of itself can be viewed as, I would say, not only a form of multilateralism, but I would say the most radical form of multilateralism. So it's a principle that is very much embedded in the European integration project. And Homi, in a sense, makes, I think, a very powerful argument as to how it is a principle that should also be extended to multilateralism as a whole in order to strengthen its legitimacy, because at the end of the day, what matters is, yes, the input side, and Bernardo and Maha were essentially mainly talking about the input side of the equation, in talking about what kind of actors we should involve in order to be more legitimate, in order to be more inclusive. But then, of course, there's the output side of the equation. You know, what is it concretely? And Shafi has already allowed us to make the transition towards this aspect of the conversation. What is it that multilateralism can and should actually deliver, and indeed what not? So, Homi, let me turn to you now.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Natalie, and thanks to all of the organizers. Let me just add my voice to those who are congratulating the whole T20 process in Saudi Arabia this year. So I think it's worth stepping back and saying, what are the really big problems that multilateralism is not solving today? And I would highlight three. One is the global commons / global public goods. I think we're all very well aware of those. I think the second, which is very close to the heart of the G20, is the inadequacy of the financial safety net for many countries that do not have the luxury of being able to borrow in their own sometimes reserve currencies. So the asymmetry that has arisen in dealing with COVID between, if you will, the advanced economies who more or less have put in place measures that account to, as a median, something around 25 percentage points of GDP, both in terms of direct fiscal support as well as below the line loans and guarantees to businesses. And you contrast that with the fiscal space for developing countries, where low-income countries have basically been able to put in place countervailing measures amounting to 1 percentage point of their much lower GDP. That difference between the two tells us that multilateralism as an organizing principle where countries feel that the system, the global system, is supporting their economic growth is failing us. And then the very last part, I would say, and this to some extent underpins the others, is that popular support for multilateralism is really gone. And that is the responsibility of G20 leaders who, in many cases, have consistently pointed the finger at multilateralism as the cause for many of their own domestic problems. Because of that, I feel that multilateralism itself is really facing a crisis, and there is no other group than the G20 who, after all, control 80+% of the world's economic resources, to be able to put it back on a sensible footing. Because if multilateralism is to exist, it must have resources, and the resources will come from those 80%. So I think we shouldn't look to the G20 to be the legitimate, inclusive institution for the world. We have one of those. It's called the United Nations. And I think it's really important to keep the role of the G20 as a steering group quite distinct from the role of the United Nations as a legitimate, inclusive, deliberative body. But they do have distinct functions. And one of those is that the G20 is far more squarely focused on economics rather than the United Nations, which also has major responsibilities, in fact, principal responsibilities for peace and security in the world. So the unfortunate part to me, I feel, is that today many of the issues of multilateralism are bleeding into all kinds of other issues surrounding peace and security and other kinds of things, which makes the United Nations not always the most effective body at managing some of these tensions. And that's why in our policy brief, we basically call on the G20 to set up a new working group that tries to outline their vision. What is the vision for multilateralism that G20 members feel would lead to a more resilient, more secure economic structure for the world? And I think that the G20 hopefully could be in a position to draw some lines and say, there are some areas where we all need to cooperate. Climate change is the obvious one, if they can get a consensus on that. And there are other areas where we can tolerate a certain amount of difference. And importantly, not try to think of the G20 as being like the European Union, meaning a mechanism for deep integration where all kinds of institutional structures and legal structures are harmonized in a single entity. I don't think that at this point in time, that's where the G20, with the great diversity of countries, should be going for. But what they should be trying to do is establishing clear lines about these are areas where we can and need to collaborate with each other. These are areas where we can and need to coordinate with each other. And these are still other areas where we agree that it's perfectly acceptable for us to compete with each other. And some kind of a working group to try to establish those boundaries, to do it in a way that sets up some principles and present to the world as something that this is what the G20 feels would be a sensible way of approaching multilateralism, and at the end of the day, a way that we as G20 members would be able to put our money behind to support. Something like that, I feel, is we all feel is absolutely necessary.
Well, thank you, Homi, and thank you also for highlighting, I think, a fundamental point. I mean, in the sort of trade-off between, you know, inclusivity and effectiveness. I mean, I think the only way, and I would agree with you. I mean, the only way to sort of navigate those straits is to sort of have a clear idea as to what should be tackled by which multilateral forum, and not every multilateral forum should be doing everything. I mean, I remember once talking to the ambassador of a country I will not name to the United Nations, who I think defined the UN, I think, in a very interesting way. I mean, he said, you know, this is a behind the curve organization, and its usefulness is exactly this, because there are some issues which have become established. And I would even put climate change in that department. I mean, you know, something that there is now more or less a consensus that it's something that has to be tackled. And you need to have an organization which is inclusive, that pushes things in that direction, as opposed to sort of newer areas, and probably some of the themes that very interestingly actually came out as a very prominent theme in this particular task force, which is everything connected to digital and to AI, as being areas where a narrower multilateral format is perhaps the more effective way to go forward. But perhaps before closing, Homi, a very, very final question to you. I mean, you know, when you challenge the, or rather when you highlight the fact that multilateralism is increasingly challenged and basically sort of not believed in by public opinion, I'm just wondering to what extent this is the product of a political season. I mean, let's call it a season of nationalist populism, which has not been limited to Europe. I mean, it's certainly been there in the United States, as well as to other parts of the world. So to what extent is it connected basically to something which is broader and which may, question mark, be ending or be reinforced by COVID? I mean, I think, you know, elections will tell. You know, the elections coming up will tell. I mean, I tend to be relatively optimistic on this particular point. But I guess my question to you is it something that multilateralism can fix itself, or is it simply going to be the product of the domestic political climate within key countries and regions that will affect the appeal or otherwise of multilateralism?
I mean, I am quite optimistic that many of these issues can be fixed. What I would say is that there's always been in multilateralism a bit of a division of labor, meaning that the multilateral system was conceived of as being one where there would be efficiency gains for all countries. And then it was the duty and responsibility of each country to manage the domestic apportionment of those efficiency gains in an equitable and fair fashion. Many of those national responsibilities have actually not been carried out to the extent that the populace feels that they have benefited from multilateralism, and that ultimately has potentially eroded the belief in the benefits from multilateralism. Now, it could also be the case that multilateralism has gone too far to highlight efficiency at the expense of resilience. And as a result, we see repeated crises, and maybe it's not quote unquote efficient in the long run. That's the kind of issue that I think really would be a useful one for the G20 to have a strong discussion about. And that's not about, to be honest, the geopolitics of the way in which supply chains are currently organized. It is one about the economics of what kinds of shocks we have, how we're going to deal with shocks, what is the frequency of shocks, and what are better long-term solutions. And we all use this phrase of build back better, but in some sense that has to fit within a global multilateral organization. And I would say on that our current multilateral organizations, I mean, we talk about these organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, which, by the way, also have multi-country representation. I mean, whether you believe that their particular mechanism of governance is the right one or not, every one of them is undergoing some kind of governance reform. And it's really important to remember that all of these multilateral institutions actually have quite significant differences in their governance. They're not all identical, and that's probably a good thing. But they are ultimately constrained by their shareholders in terms of what they want to do, because the shareholders themselves haven't really made up their minds about what is the real mandate, the real resources, and allowed these entities to then go off and make their contributions. And that's really the discussion that we need to have. Stop talking about multilateralism and be much more realistic about what are the organs and institutions and resources that we're putting in, and what can we reasonably expect the outcomes to be as a result of that.
Well, thank you so much for that, Homi. In fact, thanks to all panelists. I think this has been a very rich, although sort of intense but brief debate. But on that note, now let me turn back the floor to Bruno, that is going to introduce our last panel. Bruno.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And that was an intensive panel indeed, very interesting, and I'm sure will help all of us to think differently about how and whether to reform the G20 and other multilateral institutions, how to structure all these reform endeavors and the trajectory of what is ahead. The question of the nature of multilateralism actually is a very good bridge to our third panel on governing AI and the cyberspace. And for the introduction of the panel, I'm handing over to Ronja, who's a program director of international affairs at the Körber Stiftung and a special advisor at the Paris Peace Forum.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and welcome everyone to this penultimate session for today. Thank you for staying with us for such a long time, and I'll promise that this will be a really inspiring and interactive discussion. We will now zoom into one subset, or rather one specific policy field of multilateral cooperation, and also perhaps international competition, if I may say so, and namely the questions of cyber and AI governance. I find this more than appropriate because these are the issues that may well form the ultimate litmus test for the international system on whether it is able to deliver on its promise to create a fair and inclusive, but also a secure international environment. And we will look at these questions with our speakers that you should now be able to see on the screen. I used my power as moderator to decide that we won't go into the policy briefs one by one, but we will do a kind of interactive conversation. So I really also encourage the audience to send in your questions. I'll make sure to integrate them in the conversation. Now, our speakers. Who do we have with us? We have, first of all, Maria Belén Abdallah, who is a coordinator of the Political Institutions Program at CIPEC in Argentina. Welcome, Belén. She told me she never really liked technology. She didn't even have social media accounts for a long time, but then got infected by the topic when she realized how great the impact of technology on society is. So welcome, Belén. Also with us is Torsten Jelinek, who's a senior fellow and director of the Europe Center of the Taihe Institute, a Chinese think tank, and he's a former associate director of the World Economic Forum. Torsten's first degree, interestingly, was in software engineering, and he said that he wasn't good enough at it, so he went into political sciences. I'm sure this is a huge understatement, but I'm really happy that you sort of bring both perspectives to this conversation. So welcome to you as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Sean Riordan with us, the director of the European Institute of International Studies, and also a senior fellow at the Charhar Institute and a senior consultant with UNITAR, the UN Institute for Training and Research. His first cyber experience dates back to the year 1999. Before he even had an own computer, he worked with the British Foreign Service on the year 2000 problem, which many of you might remember. And if I remember correctly, which didn't turn out as badly as many had feared. And compared to the challenges we're facing today, this seems like a minor problem in hindsight, perhaps. Talking about the challenges we are facing, I would like to start off our conversation with one question to all our speakers on what you really believe is the greatest challenge that cyber issues and or AI in particular pose to societies around the globe. So let's just start off with some views on this question. And Torsten, why don't we start with you? I know that you mentioned this in your policy brief, so you have the floor for this.
Thank you, Anja, for your kind introduction. And also thanks a lot to the co-chairs for carrying us through since January, even before helping and being a source of inspiration to put together the policy briefs and to share our insights at certain points. And actually our policy briefs, so we are in total 4 authors. In the meantime, a lot of work, and we got more traction by the new journal from Springer Nature, AI and Ethics. So it was accepted and published actually just 2 days ago. So we doubled the amount of words and could broaden the audience and attract more regarding the topic. So actually, you mentioned it, my 2 degrees, one is in computer science and one is actually in social science. It actually says that the technology is not the solution to our challenges, right? It is actually somehow a problem to our challenges as well. This duality, I think, AI and digitalization shows that challenges we face here, that AI will be a solution to problems, but it reminds us how fragile maybe our values are, how fragile our existing governance systems are to deal with cyber physical risks, which are increasing, but also, and more importantly or equally important, the structural risks, which are not directly technological, but which have an impact on labor markets, on the economy, on governments, on international relations. However, having said that, most of those challenges have not yet materialized. So we think that that the emphasis, the current emphasis, like all the other colleagues in the world, on actually strategic competition will not solve the problem of such a global trend like digitalization and AI. So we emphasize in our paper collaboration, and we also emphasize a more sense of centrality around this issue of digitalization and AI. And the G20 has that centrality still, and also it bridges between groups of countries which see themselves as competing against each other. And but nevertheless, they still come together within this regime complex, which is needed. Why the G20? Because digitalization and AI is an economic force, and that's the right place to do. With our policy brief, we remind ourselves that actually governance is the possibility for collaboration, and governance is a political mechanism which basically emphasizes that technology itself will not sort out the problem. We need politics, we need governance to do that. But this kind of governance needs to be guided by a common theme, which is the emphasis on collaboration, or at least to respect differences with the effort to reducing those differences over time. So we believe that such a focus will help us to sort out and tackle these issues, as opposed to focusing on rivalry or competition. And last but not least, if we could add more central coordination, not in terms of an EU body, this is not what the previous speaker said, this is not the intention with our policy brief, but some sort of global coordination beyond just a normative framework. We believe this would also strengthen the various networks of governance of digital and AI, and the polycentric approaches we are already seeing emerging everywhere, trying to deal with the challenges. This is our main pitch with the policy brief.
Thanks very much for outlining this, Torsten. If I could press you a bit on this notion of collaboration that you emphasize quite strongly. I mean, if we look at the current international environment, it's not really the time for big moves on collaboration, it seems. And also zooming into the G20, we have a vast array of states and with very different interests. So what do you think would have to happen, or how can we be successful on moving towards such a collaborative stance, perhaps?
What we see now on the digital are three blocks, if you wish, emerging or emerged already. One is called the US Clean Network Program. The other one is the EU's digital infrastructure data sovereignty strategy, if you wish. And then most recently, China's Global Data Security Initiative. So they don't deal with, we focus on the AI piece, but in the broader sense, this focus all on things digital. And what they all have in common is a longing or a return of the nation state, emphasis of sovereignty to deal with privacy and to deal with security issues, fair enough, and to get a hold. So it's kind of a counter movement towards the rampant globalization where we lost the nation state. And maybe this is also what we associate, this kind of extreme globalization, which we associate with multilateralism, and then multilateralism has lost its appeal because it's blamed for that, which in fact was a medium, was a mechanism to manage the
downside of such globalization. So we see this kind of reproduced in the digital spheres, because the digital is the new economic force. So yes, you're right, this is a little bit of a dark age, but nevertheless, it should not stop us to promote this and to seek it with the G20. So far, if you look at these two major blocs, the China and the US, there are currently no diplomatic interaction going on. This is basically the only visible thing we see is in the media, a militarization or accounts on cyber espionage and cyber attacks. But nevertheless, the G20 is still here, right? So there is some opportunity of diplomatic exchange. And actually, this is really the core of our policy brief, to use that moment and to find a mechanism to accept difference, to actually not just emphasize the commonality, just to accept the difference and work around those differences. I think this is maybe also the opportunity, should be there a change with the presidency in the United States, that there's a more push towards accepting those differences. It will not sort out everything, for sure not, but it might bring back a recognizable way of diplomatic exchange. And we don't want to just leave it in a generalized sense. We picked AI as one topic to practice that, because AI has a double edge. It's a meaning of competitiveness and economic growth, but it's used geopolitically, which will separate us and which will maybe further decouple us economically, politically, maybe socially. So this is exactly a counter policy brief to the current emphasis on strategic competition and on rivalry, which the US promotes most strongly, but also, unfortunately, the European Union is emphasizing in regard to China or Russia. And I think here, except, okay, one more sentence, but okay. In regard to other groupings, the G20 has this kind of inclusivity still.
Thanks very much. Well understood. Let's bring in the others. Belen, I would like to turn to you, because your paper also looks at AI governance more specifically, but I think it also makes a very strong point on the fact that there needs to be a common understanding about AI concepts and other means to work against an increasing fragmentation of systems. So I would like to ask you how you feel that this could be achieved and what you raise in your policy brief about this.
Thank you very much for that question, and also to the T20 for giving us the possibility to share and discuss our work throughout this year. As you were saying, fragmentation is one of the key issues that we raised in our policy brief that we worked alongside Andres Ortega from Elcano Royal Institute and Julia Pomares from CIPEC. Fragmentation matters because of two key components. The first one is perhaps the most obvious one. AI presents transnational challenges that require coordinated responses. There are cross-cutting issues that need to be addressed. The second one is about its effects. Fragmentation can lead to the emergence of new tensions, as Thornstein was mentioning previously regarding competition. It can produce new sources of inequality or reinforce pre-existing ones. So right now, there are many regional entities and national and subnational governments that are developing strategies for AI. Most of them focus on grand overarching principles. According to some research from Ethics and Policy Lab, between 2016 and 2019, there were over 84 public-private initiatives released with statements that described high-level principles or values that are meant to guide the governance of AIs. But we believe, and that's the point that you made and that we were stressing in our policy brief, that agreements that are based on ideas such as fairness and security fail to address fundamental normative and political tensions that are embedded in these key concepts. Common goals cannot be taken for granted in AI development, And most of the initiatives produced so far have few specific recommendations or proven methods to translate these principles into practice. At best, this conceptual ambiguity can allow for context-sensitive specifications, which is definitely an important point, but at worst, it can mask fundamental disagreement and drive ethics and AI ethics specifically towards moral relativism and inaction. If we stand somewhere in the middle, it means that it won't actually reflect any meaningful consensus on common practical directions for the development and governance of AI. So without a fundamental shift in regulation, in translating principles into action, into practice, this will remain a competitive and not cooperative process. So the main recommendation in our policy brief that we have developed is the need to move beyond principles. We need to achieve basic consensus on the meaning of the core concepts regarding AI, and we must achieve this through cooperative, multi-stakeholder, and multidisciplinary processes. We believe the G20 has a key role to perform this by convening technical experts from academia and industry to explore these shared concerns and consider alternate framings to build the appropriate terminology and identify those issues that are in dispute.
Thank you very much for also some very excellent points. Let me ask you also a follow-up question on one issue that you raised prominently in the paper, and that's the question of transparency and legitimacy. And I think a common theme of all your policy briefs, in fact, is this need for a multi-stakeholder cooperation, meaning particularly the involvement of private or non-state actors. And I think the question of legitimacy is a very pertinent one in this respect. And I would like to ask you, Belen, to elaborate a bit on your considerations on how such new approaches could remain or could be more legitimate than they have been in the past.
Thank you. That's a great point, because most of the developments that are produced so far lack transparency, lack accountability methods, and that's the main point about the idea of bringing multi-stakeholder initiatives and creating this sort of initiatives. It's, as Blair was mentioning with Julia at the beginning of today's session, the whole of society needs to be involved. And this means bringing not only different perspectives so that we can actually understand each other, but making clear and transparent what we cannot agree on and what we cannot agree on specifically. And the point of the private sector is fundamental, because AI is largely developed by the private sector for deployment in private contexts, like insurance sector, for example, but it's also used in public ones with criminal sentencing and many, many other more. So the fundamental aims for developers, users, affected parties, and governments do not necessarily align. So we need to really rethink the ways in which we can achieve accountability in an era of algorithms, and we have developed a few recommendations regarding that specific point. We truly believe that G20 leaders should commit to make information publicly available, to allow people to meaningfully assess how systems are being implemented for public policy function, how they're being used, and adopt clear procedures related to the collection, usage, storage, and sharing of personal information. And perhaps online global public consultations could be an example of an initiative that could be put in place to help participation and information dissemination. It's all about guaranteeing transparency and human control and accountability so that we are sure that AI can work for all.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, Sean, thanks for being very patient. I'm going to turn to you. Now, your paper looks at norms creation in cyberspace more generally, and I think you propose a series of very interesting measures for the G20 to take, ranging from various working groups to capacity building programs, but also something that I personally found extremely interesting, the appointment of an ambassador to the tech sector. And you argued that we need all this this because we can no longer rely on international law. This won't be enough. So perhaps you could tell us a bit on why this is the case and how this should be achieved. And your paper is also very strong on this need for a bottom-up diplomacy, including many actors. So maybe you could share some of your thoughts on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Mario, and thanks to the T20 for all the work they've done. I think the question you asked right at the beginning was, what do we see as the most difficult issue to deal with? And I think that one of the most difficult issues we've got to deal with in the 21st century is how do we create new norms of behavior at a global level? In the case of cyberspace, there have been various assertions that international law applies in cyberspace, but no one ever explains what that means. So if we see the General Assembly has affirmed that the UN Charter applies in cyberspace, well, one of the most important parts of the UN Charter is about peace and international security, and talks about armed attacks and how countries can respond to an armed attack, but we have no definition of an armed attack in cyberspace. We have problems with attribution, we have problems with what neutrality and other concepts from international law mean. So in a sense, we can say that international law applies in cyberspace, but then we've got to explain what it means. And we need to go beyond that, because there are lots, as a former diplomat, I'm aware that many of the things that we do in international relations don't actually have international laws relating to them, rather norms of behavior, norms of accepted activity. So for example, espionage is not covered by any international law. There are simply rules of the game about what is acceptable in the physical space, what is not, what used to be acceptable, for example, in the Cold War, and what was not. And yes, I am old enough to remember the Cold War and work in it. But we don't have that for cyberspace. So we need to think about how can we create norms of behavior that are relevant to the cyberspace. For example, in terms of operations, do we have certain kinds of targets that are immune, like critical civilian infrastructure? We have no international agreement on that. So how do we get to these norms? And particularly, how do we get to these norms in a world in which the UN, which would be the normal place to go, is pretty much frozen on these issues? And the UN has not successfully been able to advance the cyberspace regulation agenda. We've got two working groups at the moment opposing each other. And this is because of basically the block in the Security Council that doesn't allow you to take forward innovative policy making. So what we suggest in the paper is that we need to get around that. We need to involve non-state actors for two reasons. One, they help us get around the problem by making this less a conflict between nations rather than a conversation about what kind of global society we want to live in. But secondly, non-state actors are really important in cyberspace. They're the big internet companies, they're the users. If we look at ECAN, which is governs issues like names and numbers in cyberspace, this is a multi-stakeholder organization. This really is a model that we need to try and develop for broader creation of norms in cyberspace. And I think we have to abandon the idea that we have big summits and big conferences which decide laws in a high level and then impose them down. That's actually not how international law was created in the past. International law in the past was created by practitioners creating accepted practice and then inviting the lawyers to codify it. And in a sense, we need to get back to that idea that we're going to create norms bottom up, getting non-state actors, whether it's companies, users, NGOs, talking with governments, forming coalitions, and progressively constructing the norms in cyberspace of the practical way in which we're going to be able to do it. So I think that was the core argument underlying the paper. And I think finally, the idea of having the G20, having an ambassador to the tech industry, is not new. Denmark got there before everyone else got there, when they named Kasper Klinger as their tech ambassador. But the idea that these tech companies, the big internet companies, are so powerful, the Facebooks, the Microsofts, the Apples, or if we're looking elsewhere, Tencents, the Alibabas, and so on, these companies are so powerful that they, in effect, become geopolitical actors in their own right, rather like the oil companies did in the past. And we need to be engaging with them on these issues of norms in cyberspace. And there's a great opportunity for the G20. The UN is non-functional in this area. The G20 is in a much better place to promote a multi-stakeholder approach and to engage directly with the tech industry.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You, in fact, already answered my second question that would have led to the G20. And seeing we're almost out of time, I would like to close this off with a second round of questions in reverse order. And I would like everyone to imagine we're in 2030 now, so 10 years from now. And what I would like to hear is 2 sentences, by each of you, excuse me, on like what you think your realistic assessment of how the future of cyber governance would look like in 2030, and what would be your preferred or your more idealistic version? How would you want cyber or AI governance to look like? Let's go in reversed order. So it's Sean first, then Belen and Torsten. 2 sentences each.
I'm going to slightly change it. A vaguely idealistic world would be where we've been able to construct norms of behavior that are broadly accepted so that we're not living in a Hobbesian anarchy in cyberspace. It won't be perfect, but it's good enough and it avoids worse consequences. My worst case scenario is that cyberspace becomes like physical space in the 1930s. We announce big international rules about how to behave and they have no effect on what's really going on in the world.
Excellent, thank you. Belen, your 2 versions.
Right now, I think we are leading, and well, we're actually living in a fragmented scenario with disintegration and with little cooperation in terms of AI and cyberspace, but I don't want to be deterministic about this. I don't think technology is leading us anywhere on its own. I think it's important to remember that there are humans in the driver's seats, and it is up to us to determine where we go from here. So I agree with Sean's perspective of having a little bit more of cooperation.
Brilliant, thank you. And Torsten, what are your views?
Well, there's this dichotomy within the notion of singularity. For some, it might be the ultimate freedom, you know, a collective brain we can navigate. For others is a dystopian vision where we lose the sense of subjectivity. So I think in 10 years or 21st century governance is a step-by-step approach. And we're facing certainly a federated internet, federated digital regimes. And hopefully we have these passages, these channels of digital collaboration between those federated internets. I think this federation or balkanization is inevitable, but we need to work on that there are those channels, digital channels, within the next 10 years.
Thank you very much. So freedom and fragmentation seem to be the 2 F's that we should pay close attention to. As usual, I would say we should prepare for the realistic versions and perhaps hope for the more idealistic ones and work towards them. And I think with your policy briefs, you've done a great deal towards that end. So thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. Thank you to the audience for listening in, and thank you to the team of T20 for organizing this event. I'm going to stop here and turn it back to Bruno. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Ronja. Thank you, Torsten, Belen, and Sean for this fascinating discussion and focusing on this interplay between politics, technology, norms creation, and human freedom and the fragmentation of institutions. I think that was fascinating, and I very much enjoyed listening to it, as I'm sure all the other participants have too. And wrapping up this webinar already, I'm tempted to say, I'm handing over to Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, the chair of T20 Saudi Arabia and the vice president, head of research at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, CAPSAC.
Thank you, Brony. Thanks everybody. It's good to be among friends today on discussing an important topic for the T20 and as well as for the G20. This topic is one of the legacy topics that we cover from one presidency to another. And I think that will be the case as well in future presidency in Italy and India. I would like to, on behalf of the T20 Secretariat, thank our lead co-chair for Dr. Abdulaziz bin Sagar for his hard work throughout the year and for swiftly shifting from in-person meetings to virtual meetings and managing managing a very diverse group and getting all the policy briefs together on time. Thank you very much for the lead authors, the co-chairs for their work with us during these difficult times. Last week, I attended a meeting at the G20 with the Sherpas of the G20, where we have highlighted many of our policy recommendations that are driven bottom up, and we appreciate the work that everybody have done in informing us at the Secretariat, which we carry the information to the G20. Frankly, this year is a unique year in its challenge. We faced the pandemic starting from March. We had our event, mid-year event in June, but I think there was an important challenge on the process of the T20 under this COVID-19 pandemic, which the meetings of the G20 have been shortened. Usually the meetings that take two days shortened to 2 or 3 hours only. And with that, it was shortened, the ability of the engagement groups to engage was shortened during these meetings. But what we did is we opted for issuing many statements, official statements, and many of these statements find their way to our audience, in particular, the G20 leaders. Of course, the topic of this task force is extremely important during this time. I think the global challenge, the challenge that we're facing is global in nature, and it does require that we respond together. We need to protect multilateralism and economic development at time of rising protectionism and global anxiety, and these are the basic or the top priority for our task force, and we heard it today throughout the discussion. But the fact in the ground is there is, especially with COVID-19, there is a visible tendency to close borders, which poses a high risk. To mention one of them is or elaborate all the risk, all the gains made by all from global trade. So some of our recommendations that we highlighted in the T20, which are taken from many of the policy briefs that were produced under this task force, is to establish solid steps that are needed to reduce anxiety and foster trust among states. One of the main recommendations that we deliver to the T20 is the call for, to the G20 is the call for a G20 working group on future of multilateralism, which I think needed more than ever before, and to establish SDGs as the principles of coordination and collaboration among countries. We also need to scale up G20 multilateral stakeholder engagement at all levels, with a special focus on Africa, which is underrepresented in the G20 leadership. And last but not least, we direct global wealth to sustain gains from global trade, which includes coordinating wealth funds, sovereign wealth funds of the G20 states to that purpose, as well as addressing investments gap and sustainable infrastructure. These are some of the recommendations that were highlighted in many of the policy briefs that we looked at within the context of this task force. There are many, and we are now in the process of drafting our T20 communique, which will be released on October 31st and November 1st during our last 2 days of the summit season. I would like to extend a special thanks to the co-lead institution, CAPSARC and KF-CRIS, for their dedication and help on organizing and financing the T20 Saudi Arabia. A special also thank for our co-host today, CEPIC. Thank you very much, Julia, for agreeing to co-host the event today. And I would like to remind everybody that we are in the middle, while we celebrate the conclusion of this task force today, we are at the T20, we are still in the middle of our summit season with 2 events per week, 2 summit events per week. So we have Task Force 8 next week on Tuesday, the same time, and this is an open invitation for everybody to participate on that event as well. I would like to thank our team in the T20 who are behind the scene in the other room, making sure that we are running our technology as smooth as possible, making these events making these events happen as they are, and we're adjusting now to speaking to screens rather than speaking to people. Well, hopefully soon we will shift that. We're working closely with our Italian counterparty in Italy to make sure there is a smooth handover. And you've seen in all of the webinars, the closing remark is always by an Italian representative. So we thank our Italian colleagues for their participation throughout the summit season. With that, I would like to conclude and thank you all for attending and participating in this webinar. And I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday, inshallah. Thanks and have a great day.